Hello, everyone. Call to order this Thursday, June 19th meeting of the Underhill Planning Commission. There's no one from the public here, so does anyone have any changes to the agenda? Nope. All right. That takes us to the trail amendments. Just as a brief reminder to and new for you. This was like, David, maybe you can help me remember. This was like 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago. It's been a bit. Where we approved all of these. We went through, drafted the language, and then it's been sitting there because we didn't have Larry. So I think the goal tonight, obviously, Zach, you're very welcome to comment on them. You haven't seen them before. Everyone else, we're kind of like refreshing our recollection as to what we did that long ago. But in an ideal world, we will look at Larry's excellent work here and say, yes, with some minor changes or no changes, these are good to go. So that's the goal. It's pretty short, as you can see. So do you want to kick us off, Larry? Because I know you had some questions on the file. Yeah.
Okay, so I made a few minor changes. I just confessed that I may have made some typos because I couldn't find an actual draft to cut and paste from, so I just had to retype it, but it wasn't that long. So there was a lot of repetition between the three sections. So this is divided into three sections. So the first section is, first two sections are in amendments to section 3.19, surface waters and wetlands. The first blurb, the first paragraph would place trails that are built within stream setbacks and wetland buffers as permitted uses, meaning that someone who proposed a new trail within the wetland or stream buffer would only have to come in, talk to the zoning administrator, and get a permit, a zoning permit for it. Wouldn't require a public hearing or anything. If all they're doing is sending a part of a trail through the setback or the buffer, no other efforts, no other construction associated with that. So that would include, and the important distinction here, and this is something we should talk about, is that the permitted trail encroachment could be in a situation where the trail is incidental to either a property owner using the trail for their own access or their own recreational use, or a trail which is open to the public, which would include bridge crossings or access points. And there's a few caveats in there, like you should not try to cross a stream where the stream is wide or deep. You should focus places where the stream is narrow. You're going to put a bridge across it, you should do it where the stream is narrow, and that bridges and access points have to be reviewed and approved by the stream alteration engineer at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. So that's the first topic. Only requires a zoning permit if you want to do that. Second topic is conditional uses. So this would be a situation where in order to get approval to put in a trail into the wetland or stream buffer or setback, you would have to go to the Development Review Board and get a conditional use permit. And the principal distinction or difference here from the first section is that this would be for trails which are on private land and only open to paying guests or organizational members, not open to the general public. This is where it gets a little confusing.
Well, there's something that go ahead. There's something there in the copy that you got that's bad, Larry.
Okay.
Like, and it's not your fault, obviously. You weren't here. We specifically do not want to give any leeway to if someone wanted to open a trail network and charge people.
Yes.
Yeah, they don't get any of this. Like, we don't want, the explicit discussion was that that's never gonna happen here. But if someone wanted to do like the Kingdom Trails here, they would not benefit from these. That was the explicit discussion at the time. So I don't know how the paying guests bit, like maybe that was just an error.
Oh,
So there's something where we don't want paid, if someone wanted to open a like paid trail,
yeah.
they don't benefit from this leniency, this exception.
They would have to get a conditional use
Correct.
for a business,
Right.
so.
Yeah. So that is somehow was screwed up in the copy that you got.
Okay.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite. Okay. But I was wondering about that because, in most cases in zoning, if you want to do something on private land, your own land, or for your invited guests, that doesn't really have any significant impact on the community or on the resource, it's really not the town's business, and you don't have to ask for permission to do that. It's like, you want to have a bonfire on your land and there's not a red flag alert, go ahead, have a fire on your land.
So the genesis of all this is a lawsuit between two private parties
Yes.
over the construction of a bridge on some mountain bike trails.
Yes.
So all we were trying to clarify, and those are on private lands.
Yes.
So you may already know this, but what we were trying to just do is prevent conflict in the future.
Yes.
To have clear rules where everyone knows what's happening and hopefully no one's suing anyone.
Okay.
So those are private lands, so that might be why it feels a little off.
Yes.
Does it not feel right to you still, even with that explanation? Is there something we need to fix?
Well, okay, let me finish
Okay.
the piece here. So,
Okay, sorry.
and then the last section is the exemption section of our regs. So 10.2 exemptions mean that you don't have to get a permit of any kind to do the things that are on this list. And there's a lot of things that are on the list, but it's a long list. But this is essentially proposing, this section would add trails to this list, and you can see that A through E are things that automatically kick the project off of this exempt list and onto one of the two previous lists, because they're saying, if you're going to put in a parking area, if you're going to put in a structure, like, I don't know, a large storage shed for rented bikes or something like that, if you're going to put in a boardwalk, if you're going to put in a bridge, and if we're going to use motorized earth moving equipment, like a big grader or earth mover of some kind, all these things would kick it into the things that would require a permit. But if it's just a trail, 6 feet or width or less, going into a stream buffer, then it doesn't require a permit. So does the structure of this make sense? It's as best as I could understand.
It does. What I'm trying to understand, and this is more for the group that was there, on C, we're just going so far back in time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if that's what we intended, because we had a lot of discussion about like how big a boardwalk could be, and I'm not sure if everyone remembers that.
Yeah, I do.
Basically, if you were putting in on mountain bike trails, there tends to be, as you probably know, these thin little boardwalks, right? And maybe it's 5 feet long and 2 feet wide or something, right? But 10 feet long, 2 feet wide. As long as those were compliant with wetland rules, as I'm remembering it, like, we wanted you to be able to go ahead and do that.
Do that without a permit.
Correct. That's my recollection, because it doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise. And I remember there was discussion with Sandy, and there was discussion about, like, what if someone wanted to put in a 200-foot boardwalk that's 8 feet wide, well, like 6 feet wide, right?
Or even 3 feet or 4 feet.
Right. Well, now you're starting to have a substantial impact on the wetland, which is not what we were intending. So,
but if it's on private land, you can still these exemptions, you need to get a permit.
well, that goes to
Larry's.
Larry's.
Only if it's paying guests.
Well, so this is essential.
This is where we have to clean these up.
Yeah.
So my first question is, what's the logic to requiring trails and related improvements on private lands that are not open to the public to undergo conditional use review, but then allow trails and related improvements that are open to the public as a permitted use? Because I thought it might actually be intended to be the other way around. because of what I raised earlier.
Well, the private land option was because it would be a business, is that right? Do you remember it that way?
No, I remember we specifically spoke about the situation that brought it up, which is this lawsuit over the mountain bike trails on private land. But then we also specifically spoke about how, so we wanted to help put some clarity around that situation so everyone knows what the rules are and there's no one, so we know anyone. And then but then what we specifically spoke about, to my recollection, is, but we didn't want that to carry over to the hypothetical situation where someone decided to open the Kingdom Trails here and charge people, and that's a whole different ballgame.
Because that's a business.
That's a business.
Yeah, okay.
But, I mean, maybe I got this wrong, but the overarching issue here is that we have rules in place which follow state requirements as well, that we protect the natural resource. And the natural resource in this case is either a stream bank or a wetland buffer. And that, we, as a policy matter, we are encouraged to follow the state's lead, which is to not allow development activities that are intrusive or potentially damaging to stream banks and to wetland buffers, because those are regulated by the state.
Yep.
Stream crossings are regulated by Agency of Natural Resources, and encroachments into wetlands typically require A&R review. If there's a private development which is proposed that would bump part of a parking lot into a wetland buffer or something, they have to get the A&Rs to give to look at it in depth and give a thumbs up if they're going to allow it. So I think, to me, any exceptions that we make to those 50-foot setbacks or stream buffers, have to be based on what we think are sound principles of land use management that deal with real life needs in Underhill. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think that most towns have something like this in place. When I worked in Bolton, we talked about this issue and mostly in connection with, are people familiar with the Bolton potholes, the swimming holes, and right along the bottom of the access road? So there have been issues over the years with people drowning and people parking their cars illegally and blocking traffic there. And while I was working in Bolton, the Vermont River Conservancy came in and bought the river, that section of the river and the banks of it, and agreed to manage it with clear trail markings so that it would be safer for people who are not crazy to come in and go swimming in the potholes on really hot summer days, which is a popular activity. And part of that was just saying, okay, we recognize if you're going to have an unpaved trail, it's okay to go right down to the river. You're not really encroaching in a meaningful way because, frankly, the trail is already there, it's already in use. And as long as you have sufficient guidance for people not widening the trail or building a permanent structure within the setbacks of the stream, no further damage to the resource is likely to occur. People will still do crazy stuff, but this is about protecting the resource. And so everybody seemed pretty happy with that. But the moment that you start allowing things like boardwalks and platforms and bridges, you kind of have to pass the straight face test in terms of how the state would review those encroachments, because they want to make sure that the resource is not damaged. That's kind of where I'm going, without having been part of your earlier discussion.
No, I think you've got the gist of it. I mean, I think what we were trying to say was, again, if folks remember, we were trying to say, like, there's this pretty comprehensive Underhill Trails handbook. So we wanted to reference that and say, like, look, if you follow this and the location and design of the bridges and access points, follow these rules, then those are the rules everyone has to play by. And then we tried to put some common sense things around it, like you have to conform with wetlands rules for boardwalks, and you can't, your structure's limited to 150 square feet. You can't go build some giant bike park, right? But maybe we don't quite have it right.
Well, let's go back to the distinction between the first section and the second section. So you got your Underhill Trails handbook standards in there. You have the emphasis on good design, which is to say, focus where, if you're gonna cross a stream, do it where it's narrow.
Yeah.
Or confined or permanently constrained. You still have to go and get an approval, review and approval by the A&R.
Yeah.
For the extent and design of the crossing. But the first piece is, again, it's just a permitted use. So this is, basically, we're gonna leave it up to the zoning administrator to decide
Right.
if somebody's trail crossing of a stream or wetland buffer is sort of meets this general standard. And it's a thumbs up. Zoning administrator would typically grant the permit if they feel that it meets these standards, and the applicant can demonstrate that.
So the permit would be conditional on a A&R permit also?
Yeah, if you were the zoning administrator, you would require them to come to you with that document in hand from A&R. So
Is it a big deal to get that?
I don't think so, but
So shouldn't it be stated with permitted uses that the A&R permit, where appropriate, would be necessary?
Yeah, I would think of it, that should be in there.
Because, there have been cases in towns that have issued permits and then, whoops,
yes.
down the road, A&R comes in and says, tear it down or whatever.
So that's just missing from 10.2 though, I think, that you have that in E1E. That ANR is mentioned, but in the bottom there.
Well, it says it must be approved.
Yeah.
But you could make that a little more explicit and say that it,
And permitted.
and permitted,
And permitted.
yes. We could do that.
Well, that
when you
doesn't-
have permitted uses, it would seem like that'd be a good place to put it in.
Yeah, that's-
Permitted uses.
That's where he's putting it, David.
Okay.
Yeah. In the last sentence, it's gonna read, the location and design of bridges and access points must be approved and permitted. Does that makes sense, right?
I didn't follow you, sorry.
So the last sentence of permitted uses, the location and design of bridges and access points must be approved and permitted.
I'm looking at number 1, permitted uses.
Yeah, go to the bottom of 1E, like the last sentence of 1E. What you're looking at.
I'm looking at, you've got E encroachments under that 1, permitted uses. The
Yeah.
following encroachments are allowed as permitted uses requiring only a zoning permit from the zoning
Yep,
administrator.
so go to the bottom of that next paragraph. Under that, where it
Under
says,
E?
under E, where it says the location and design
Yeah.
of bridges and access points must be approved, and where he's gonna insert and permitted by the stream alteration engineer.
Well, whatever, if it covers it.
Yeah, is that, yeah,
I guess, I don't know, I just thought, up front, right at the beginning there, would just be an alert to somebody before they start going down through, A, B, C, D, E, and so on. But my own preference.
Okay.
I have one question there
Yeah.
before we leave this. So are you concerned at all about wetlands then?
Well, I think this whole section applies to wetlands. It does, yeah. And again, if it's going into a wetland buffer, it has to have that A&R review.
Okay,
Even
so we're
a class
covered.
3 wetland or the lowest.
That's a bit of a gray area, but definitely class 1 and class 2 wetlands. So A&R is pretty strict about enforcing the 50-foot.
So we're covered.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and in any event, if somebody wants to put in a crossing, they're going to go to A&R. The A&R person will come and do a site visit. They'll figure out what kind of wetland it is, and then they will say either thumbs up or thumbs down. And if they'll do it in writing either way. So if the person gets a thumbs up from A&R, they'll have that document with this amendment that David suggested.
Okay.
It's a little
Thanks, Dan.
misleading there where it says that, it says the following encroachments are allowed as permitted use requiring only a zoning permit from the zoning administrator.
Oh, yeah.
So,
That maybe it should say approved and permitted by ANR at the
Yeah.
top there. You
Yeah.
prefer, yeah.
I would think,
I can, I agree
people
with
read
that.
through this stuff, they get
Yeah.
lost in all the verbiage that we
Yeah.
throw in these things.
Yeah, so we could just add a little phrase at the end of the E1 that's and as further specified below or something to that effect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Okay, and so the basic concept here, just to get back to the bigger picture, is that if The trail is either just exclusively for the property owner and their invited friends, or if it's also open to the public, then it just requires a zoning permit, nothing more. And the A&R review, of course.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah,
what you want?
that sounds good to me. I don't know.
Okay.
Just a question, what does that entail by having the state engineer involved? And has anybody experienced that as far as their process and
I have.
their detail and
Yeah.
likelihood of building something that you can actually build?
Yeah, I don't think they charge for it, if that's what you're asking. Just to come in and do a review if it's for a private property owner. If it's a developer who wants to build like a commercial project, there will be a cost associated with that, but I don't think for this kind of a thing that there would be a charge to the landowner.
And not necessarily cost, just as far as the feasibility of building what they specify for design.
I think they would definitely tell you, I think they get pretty clear messages like you can do this or you can't do this. And if they tell you can do it, they will set conditions sometimes, like, yeah, you can have a little bridge over this, but it can't be more than this long and this wide, and you have to support it in certain ways. You have to maybe suspend it, nothing in the actual stream bed. And I'm not familiar with all the nuances of how all that works, but somebody told me in one of my first planning jobs that they had never experienced A&R denying a wetland encroachment permit in their entire history in municipal government. So I've taken that as probably pretty clear guidance that that's their pattern. So it's not that they're unlikely to say absolutely no, you can't do that. They're more likely to say yes, but and here's how you have to minimize it.
Do you have any idea what the relationship with an organization like VAST, with all the trails that they have, what they would have to go through for the process, because they cross numerous streams and wetlands and everything else?
Yeah.
They go through the state for all those approvals?
I think they probably do.
Grandfathered?
I think they probably do. Yeah, I think VAST is probably intimately familiar with how all that works. Yeah, very familiar with it.
That network operates kind of like the Underhill bike trails though, maybe, or I'm not certain, but you don't have to pay to use the Bass trails, I think, right? Or folks.
You're
you have to be a
supposed
member.
to be a member and buy a sticker, I think.
Yeah. Well, let's say, the commercial uses thing is one other, the other idea that came to me was like, what if someone's got, a little eco resort or a little Airbnb and they want to build a sauna in the woods and they want to cross through a wetland? Like that should definitely be, I think this provides for that already, but that should have to be, shouldn't be automatic from the zone.
Sure. If they're going through the town, either for a zoning permit or a DRB review, someone in the town will tell them, oh, by the way, reinforce that, oh, by the way, you have to go talk to this person at A&R, and here's the number you call, and here's a person to ask for. It's obviously, if it's just a zoning permit, it's going to be, it depends on who's sitting in the zoning administrator's chair and how diligent they are as far as whether they follow up and actually, can you show me the permits? Give me a copy of the A&R permit that you got with the specific conditions, or not. But, it's generally, you're saying that you think that in that situation, the first paragraph, that we trust the zoning administrator to do the right thing and follow appropriately. If it's going through DRB review for conditional use, it's going to be a more involved process, and there's always automatic public hearing. So the DRB, you have to pay a chunk of money to apply for the DRB. You have to fill out this whole application. You have to provide corollary paperwork and site plan, and blah, 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 blah. So it's a more elaborate process, and there's more eyes on it. And if the neighbors would object to it, then they have a chance to object through participating in the public hearing on the proposed conditional use review. So that leads us to the second paragraph. So if it's open to paying guests, organizational members, but not open for general public use, this is a situation you automatically want to kick it to the DRB for conditional use review, correct?
That's, the discussion we were having, well, what we're trying to do, Larry, is I view this as never happening, just to be clear. But what we're trying to do was, if someone wanted to open some giant mountain bike park here, they don't get the same benefit as a private landowner or someone who's got a little club that, by club, I mean, that's not the right
No
word.
fees.
Like, no fees.
Yeah.
Like, people come and help out on the trails or whatever.
Yes.
Different than paying or not open to other people, commercial.
Yeah, commercial.
Yeah, that was the intention behind this.
Okay.
Now, it might not be written correctly, but that was the intention.
Okay.
Would commercial use be better than paying
Maybe that's
gas?
the right way to say it.
Yeah, something like that.
Yes. I think so.
Yeah, maybe we can just eliminate half that sentence by
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
that it's for commercial.
Or
use.
home business too. Yeah, it would fall under that, wouldn't it? Which is conditional use review.
Right. Like your example. From
Yeah, if it was something like that, yeah.
Okay. So we can declutter it quite a bit here. So instead of saying paying guests
Quite clunky.
or members, we can just say for commercial use.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Who knows, man, there might be Kingdom Trails version 3 someday.
Yeah, I mean,
Never said never,
Well,
right?
so they're getting conditional use
Yeah.
permits.
yeah, I always remember, I went to the annual meeting of the Chittenden Regional Planning Commission last night. And I found myself chatting with a woman who represents Bolton on the CCRPC. And I was reflecting on how I had worked pretty closely with the Bolton Valley company around their efforts to kind of upgrade and modernize their facility, which it basically looks like a lot like it was when it was built in 1966. It hasn't changed much. And one of the things that Bolton Valley has done, well, so they've opened up parts of their trail system to RV use, like heavy intensive, this RV training school that they have next to the Timberline Lodge, which is pretty impactful, on the trails. These, meaty four-wheel drive vehicles with giant tires that are just up the trail when they're muddy.
They have that?
They have that, yeah. It's a 4x4 school. People come from all over to learn how to drive 4x4s very aggressively on mountain roads. But then they also have, and this is more to the point, so one of the ways that they're trying to make it more of a four-season resort with a low footprint on the land is they're really promoting mountain biking on the ski trails. And so they have started running a lift on weekends during the warm weather months. And they have these special brackets that you go up to the lift and you hang your mountain bike on the bracket and then walk around and sit on a chair and ride up to the top of the mountain. And I mean, I think that that's very benign, because the ski trails are already there. They're already cut and they're wide, and people love going down them. They're bumpy and they're going down on their mountain bikes, and they'll pay for that lift ticket because it's a good way for them to generate income in the warm weather months when people are not skiing, and they also have nature camps for kids that they operate during the summer and summer concert series and stuff like that. So anyway, it's not hard for me to imagine that some entrepreneur who has a chunk of land in Bolton might say, oh, there's some great woods roads running through my property, and I'd love to, sort of encourage people to come and use their mountain bikes, and we can offer them a ski lift. But, if they want to just run little loops around my property, yeah. And with this provision, that would be considered a commercial use, and they would have to go through the DRB to get a conditional use permit if it involved stream crossings or wetland buffer encroachments.
Got it.
So that's what you want to do, right?
Yeah, that was the intention at the time.
Okay. All right. And then I put in the same amendment that David suggested at the end in the last sentence. Must be approved and permitted by the stream operational engineer. So then that leads us to the last section. And by the way, with all three of these, I inserted this language no more than 6 feet wide, because that was out of Bolton's regulations. And it seems like, that's a pretty common threshold that, a trail which is 2 feet wide or 3 feet wide is, pretty much by definition going to be less intrusive on the stream bank or the wetland than a trail which is 6 feet wide or 12 feet wide, 20 feet wide.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's a reasonable limit, to say 6 feet should be the maximum of a trail that encroaches.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
It seems very reasonable. That's pretty well.
How wide enough for a car?
Yes. Yeah, most trails I think are going to be more like 3 or 4 feet wide. But we want to just put a limit in there. So then there are these 6 exceptions here, and you were saying, Brian, before that you thought.
Well, I'm confused
Boardwalks?
by the boardwalks one.
Yeah,
I'm just
this is
like,
something that's
in my head,
handwritten.
I'm just confused.
It was
about what
handwritten
we were-
on your draft.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it, so,
Yes.
yeah. I'm just confused about what I was trying to. So you don't, none of these don't require any permit.
Yes. But that's a pretty big exception,
There's not
I
already
think.
state statute that covers how much of a boardwalk you can put, maybe that
I
might,
don't know.
yeah,
I really don't know.
What's a pretty big exception, the boardwalks one?
Yeah, potentially.
yeah.
Because, I mean, you could have a pretty substantial wetland, and you could have a 40-foot long boardwalk, 2 or 3 feet wide, right?
Doesn't point B also apply to a boardwalk?
Yeah, I wonder if that was, maybe we meant for boardwalks.
I mean,
to
it's
be-
struck out there.
That would make a lot of sense, like, because I actually remember talking about that in the meeting, like,
Yeah.
we literally had this hypothetical, I don't remember what numbers we used, but what if you built this 200-foot long,
Yeah.
10-foot wide board? And that's not what anyone wanted. So
Right.
if we collapse the boardwalk into the structures greater than 150 square feet, that seems like it would take care of it.
Okay.
Does everyone agree? I think that was probably what we were intending to do, and it's crappy note taking by me.
I wonder what other kind of structures there.
They were talking about, I remember this because Mike Weisel was in.
Boardwalk with
And he-
a rock.
Well, or he was talking about like mountain bike, little mountain bike features, for lack of a better word. You know, like a little up down type thing,
Yeah.
or
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
you know, ramps.
Jumps and,
Yeah. Yeah. But that's why we put the square footage and
Yeah.
height limitation on it. I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah, 150 square feet is very limiting. I mean,
Yeah, that's,
But it would allow you to construct a little foot wide boardwalk
Mhm.
over a 8-foot section of
Yeah.
mud.
yes.
But the only thing this does really is, says if it's outside of these parameters, has to go to the DRB. Is that
Yeah,
is that what I'm hearing?
how does this section, I can't remember anymore, how does this section relate to the top?
So,
So I get how the first two go together,
Yeah.
but how does this relate back? I can't picture.
so if you're proposing to enhance or whatever, to include any of these items, and let's throw item C off here, so it's just A, B, D, and E. So if your project of improvements includes any of these 4 remaining items, then it does kick it up to at least needing a zoning permit.
Oh, so you're right back to the DRB.
No,
Oh, you're to the ZA.
to the ZA, or if it's for private for-profit use, then it would
Then
be to
DRB.
DRB.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so these are all trying to define, I mean, you know, really putting some boundaries around what you can do. So if it's just a trail, you're not improving it at all, you're not bringing in earth moving equipment, you're not putting in boardwalks or platforms or bridges or any of that, then it's considered to be exempt from the need for a permit. But if you're doing any of these things, it kicks it up to the need for a zoning permit at least. And if it's commercial, then it requires also a conditional use permit from the DRB.
So,
To get the zoning permit approved.
Yes.
so it's special flood hazard areas only that are limiting and require a permit?
No, actually, David, so the second sentence there, outside of special flood hazard areas, because in special flood hazard areas, there's a lot more severe restrictions on what can be built. In flood hazard areas, you have to basically, a lot of kinds of construction are just prohibited outright, and any construction that happens in a flood hazard zone has to be elevated at least a foot above the 100-foot, I think it's 100-year flood zone, the designated flood zone. So it's very difficult to get permits to build anything in a flood hazard zone. So that, what to say is that all these exemptions apply only outside of the flood hazard.
So does this again skirt by what might be required by the A&R for some, a class 3 wetland or something?
That's a great question.
You know, it should again have a reference here to, if an A and R permit is necessary.
Well, isn't that what we're referring to?
The bridge crossings or access points?
Yeah.
I think that's what D is supposed to be doing. It can't involve a bridge crossing or access point.
Yeah.
So if it involves a bridge crossing or access point in D, then you're
And
right
they're
back up
not-
into
They do
the,
not involve these.
right, you can't benefit from this if you're crossing a stream or need an A. What we could do, to David's point, is I wonder if we change it to say bridge crossings, access points, rivers or streams, or this is not it, but anything else that involves an A&R permit. Like, what if it's a wetland, to David's point?
Yeah, I mean,
Or do we say wetlands, just bridge crossings, access points, rivers or streams, or wetland?
yeah, these are great questions, and I feel like this begins to introduce a different topic, which is if someone is doing something on their own land, which
Yeah.
does implicate A&R jurisdiction, for example, for wetlands crossings, to what extent is it the town need to or want to get involved in those things? Because landowners are still responsible for following the law. But if someone's doing something on their own property, like what's described in this section, and if the town doesn't have a permitting requirement, then it's kind of between the landowner and the state.
Oh, I see.
And we don't really want or need to get in the middle of that. So the previous sections, the two previous instances where it's for public use or for private use, that I think we're saying that the town does have a vested interest because we're involved in issuing a permit for that use. But if we're not involved in issuing a permit, then it's kind of up to the landowner. And if they called up or came in and visited the zoning administrator and asked about it, the zoning administrator would tell them, yeah, you probably need an A&R permit for that. But if it's meets this criteria as described here with the changes, the town would not be otherwise involved other than that verbal advice.
So you're recommending that we leave it as is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this really comes back to you guys. Like, do you think that this is the right standard that someone who is suggesting or proposing a project that's a trail like this that meets these criteria does not need a permit of any kind from the town? Is that something you agree with as a policy perspective? From a policy perspective,
I just worry about the property owner that says, "Oh, I don't need a A&R permit," and then 3 or 4 years down the road, when a neighbor says, "Hey, wait a minute, that's a wetland that you didn't get a A&R permit for, restore it."
Isn't that, I'm not trying to be a jerk, but isn't that their problem?
It is the
Like,
property owner's problem.
Should the
Yes,
town
it
be
is.
involved, to Larry's
But
point?
I'm just saying that it might be useful just to warn property owners that there may be an A&R permit that is necessary. Just so we don't, people don't go off and get caught in that really ugly
Alright.
situation.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think David, if they called the town, if they visited and said, "Can I do this?" They would get the verbal advice. They would get that warning probably. But if we're not involved in issuing a permit, then we're not implicated in any way if there's a violation discovered down the road. It's between the
I
property
understand
owners.
that. It's just,
Yeah, it's just like if somebody, if somebody cuts down, woods that are within 100 feet of a shoreline. That's a state issue, A&R issue. And some of you may know about this case a few years ago. I think it was somebody in, somewhere in like the Orange County, or no, it was in
Green River Reservoir.
Green River
Yeah.
Reservoir.
Yeah.
They had a camp on the reservoir shore, and they just clear cut all the
Come on.
trees going right
Oh, it's
down to the
crazy.
shore.
Did
Yeah,
not.
have you ever been there?
And the state not only
Must be that
fined
really
them heavily, but they said, you gotta take the camp down. We're done.
I mean, that's a multiple million
Did they
dollar
make them take their
house.
camp down?
I think they did.
They made
and
them
put in
replant the trees.
I think.
Yeah.
No, because that's a
You know,
multiple
trees or
million
something
dollar
like that.
Yeah.
structure that's still there.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, they must have made them plant trees.
Yeah,
They did.
Wow, that was a gangster move. Just
The guy was a developer from Miami.
Say no more, Bart. Say no more.
So what do you think about just putting a little warning in there? You might need a A&R permit.
we're on top of.
You know
that.
where we should look, David, versus,
Yeah.
I wonder if the Underhill Trails handbook says, that you can
Yeah.
look at your A&R permitting requirements, because I bet it might, actually.
I guess I would look that up. I didn't look at those standards.
Is everyone generally good with where we are? I know to be Zach, you're seeing it for the first time. Everyone else, hopefully this was a good refresher, but is everyone pretty good with where we are?
So do you think we should put something in or not?
Well, let's look at the Trails handbook and see what it has in it, I think. Because
Was this referencing the trails book?
oh yeah, multiple times up.
Yeah, it's in
up.
there.
If you go back,
Page 6.
if you go back up to the 2009 Underhill Trails handbook.
Well, under exemption, I was looking at that. You know, someone goes through that and says, oh, these are all the exemptions and so on. That's great. And I don't do anything with the A&R.
Isn't it a little? Here's my worry about that. If we say here, like you should go see the A&R handbook.
Yeah.
Then don't we need to say everywhere in the regs? Like you should go look at all these other resources to make sure that you're not violating that.
Well, I don't know, when you say exemptions, you know, that's a, you know, sort of a,
Pretty strong message.
yeah,
Don't worry about it.
yeah, right.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Except for, well, in the,
It wouldn't hurt to just put, you know, in that one, you know, 3 words or 4
right
words.
after the special flood hazard
Where would we
areas.
put it?
And
Right.
yeah, right there.
Well, it might even just say, you know,
And
this does not
and any
cover the
wetlands.
possibility of
Yeah.
the required A&R permit.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not picking up the edits against you.
Well, I
Read
think it would go at the very end, somewhere, like just a sentence, David saying that says like,
For the,
Possibly right in the beginning there, basically, because that's, I hate to see it just buried away.
You could
somewhere.
put it right-
Verbiage.
You could put it right after special flood hazard areas
Yeah,
or wetlands that may need A&R review, that need A&R review.
yeah.
yeah, but then what you're doing there is you're carving, I think you're not doing what you want to, because then what you're saying is if it's a wetland, none of these exemptions apply. We're then carving out wetlands altogether.
Yeah, I think it's a little, it may be too broad brush to include it under exemptions, because exemptions are, you know, it's a long list, as I mentioned before, so it includes things like, if you want to put a little shack at the bottom of your driveway for your kids to wait for the school bus, you know, you don't have to get a permit for that. If you want to put up a fence on your border, your property boundary, you don't have to get a permit for that.
I think we would have to go somewhere under little 6 here.
Yeah.
So we're not modifying all of 10.2A.
Yeah.
So we don't have to review all of that.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So maybe just
Yeah.
look at adding.
Like a final sentence after it or something like that that
Yeah.
says, what would it say? Like, this section in no way impacts a landowner's responsibility to get any A&R permits that are required or something like that.
Yeah.
That kind of gets you where you want to go, right,
Yeah,
David?
yeah, right.
Okay, so I think, Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, so at our next meeting, it sounds like we have a very brief review of Larry's changes, because they're pretty minimal,
Mhm.
and then we could sign off on this. Okay,
Yeah.
Sounds good.
thank you, everybody. Yeah, it's another one,
I was just curious,
Oh, go ahead.
the story that you were telling about these 2 landowners.
Yeah.
and the Bridge, how did this fit into
so we're
that?
going
How did
to,
you get to here?
we're going too far back for me to accurately, so here's my recollection. Because I don't remember the specific facts of there was a dispute of some sort between someone who put up a boardwalk, I think, or a bridge. Bridge. All right, sounds like other people remember better than me.
You're talking about the bike club
the
bridge?
bike club bridge.
Yeah, there's the
Someone,
bike, yeah.
so it's right near Roy's house, so you
Yeah.
can tell the story.
The bike club built a bridge, and I assume they got A&R approval for that, but I don't.
I don't know.
But they went to the Vermont Supreme Court.
It's gone all the way up.
And it twice, and the bike club won, but the guy that lives down the road sued the bike club for putting this bridge in because he didn't like it.
It was just a part of the trails.
He was saying that a permit was never granted and a permit was required.
But he made them get a permit, they got a permit, and then he sued them anyway in environmental court because he didn't think they deserved a permit. He lost in environmental court, then he went to the Supreme Court, and he lost again, and the bike club won every time right up through, and even appealed to the Supreme Court. So it's just so we had to generate a lot of this for that particular situation.
Well,
But this wouldn't prevent that particular
Yeah, to
situation
have
because we excluded
clarified.
bridges, right?
Right. I think under this, that specific situation would be allowed as long as they got the stream thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot like firewood. In other words, like firewood came up because of Gordon, but then it lands in our lap, and we're trying to create a rule that works for everyone across town, so there's certainty. And will that impact Gordon? Yeah, of course. But it's not for Gordon. Whereas like when stuff goes to the DRB, they're dealing with like this situation with Gordon. So it's like this stuff lands on our plate because it's a thing that happened. But then we're just trying to develop a rule that works for everyone. So there's certainty for everyone. And everyone knows what to expect, basically. So we're not trying to favor anyone.
Right.
So it lands on our lap because of a specific situation, but it's almost like
If that didn't occur, we probably wouldn't even be here.
it probably, yeah, if it didn't occur, no one ever would have thought of
Wouldn't
it.
be
So it
thinking
never
about
would have
it.
landed in our lap. But once it occurs, we're like, okay, well, let's set out a rule that's fair for everyone, that works for everyone.
Yeah, and mountain biking trails are a legit recreational use if they're done responsibly. I mean, it's a great way for landowners to, make some revenue off their lands if they want to charge people for it, or if they don't, if it's just going to be for fun. Getting a permit from the town doesn't protect them from lawsuits if somebody gets hurt on their bike, but it's a way to sort of legitimize it, and that goes right to Brian's point that if there's a town process that's spelled out in our land use specs for a permit, and the property owner obtained the permit legitimately, it wasn't challenged, because anytime the town grants a permit, once it's been in place for 30 days, it can't be appealed. If some neighbor decides they didn't like it and they haven't filed an appeal within 30 days, it's like too bad, because the town had a process spelled out, granted a permit, 30-day appeal period passed, this is allowed. So then it becomes, if a neighbor still wants to persist in opposing that permit, then it's a very different matter, because they're not in state environmental court. They have to file a civil suit and show how they were injured, or how their property interests were negatively impacted by it. That's a much steeper hill to climb in court. Yeah.
Which is a perfect segue to event venues, because this also came up because of a specific situation. But now we're trying to come up with a rule that works for everyone in town. And I might say that Larry clearly hates our event venues thing. There's been an entire page of questions and comments by Larry. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, I'd say hate is probably too strong a word, but yeah.
Maybe we should start over.
Well, so
Feels like Larry's suggestion. Yeah.
So let's start with my first question, because I feel like that kind of drives the rest of the conversation.
Let me give you the background in 1 minute, and everyone else can chime in here because this is newer. If you drive north on Pleasant Valley Road, sort of when you get to the top, before it starts to come down again, there is an iron gate or a metal gate to your right where someone is putting in a wedding venue that looks like a barn. I'm going to have the facts here wrong from the DRB case. Maybe someone knows better, but the way it sort of landed in our lap was there was sort of feedback like, this is a wedding venue, not a barn, but it's being built as a barn with basically everything that an agricultural would come along with an agricultural building, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we should regulate wedding venues because there's multiple ones in town now over the Cambridge town line, which obviously is not us, but there's another one going in. So it's like a thing.
Sure.
Right? So that's how it landed in our lap. And by the way, this is nothing about that person who's building this one in Pleasant Valley. That's what triggered the idea, right? Like that went to the DRB and da 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 da.
DRB wanted us to come up with
So it
some
landed in our lap.
bylaws that applied to
Yeah.
anything.
Right.
And I think what we came up with was pretty minimal, but still, it's a starting point, right?
So your answer to
So-
one is it came from the DRB.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roy. Because of this situation that landed in the DRB's lap, where someone wanted to do this thing, it looks like a barn, but it's a wedding venue, and there's like no rules. Okay, so let's have some rules.
But it's a home occupation, which they should have applied for that type of permit from the start, but they tried to use the agricultural exemption, I think, isn't that what happened?
I believe, now we're getting mired, like, I can't remember, I
Yeah.
thought they put like one stall in,
For their horse?
like a horse, and the rest of it is like a wet, I might be screwing that
A
up.
token
but,
horse.
I don't remember any of the details.
Well, I don't think they're giving the
It was an
horse
invisible
alcohol.
horse.
Was it a stuffed horse?
Either way, the takeaway was like, hey, maybe there should, from the DRB was like, maybe there should be rules for wedding venues versus people having to have it look like a barn or like, I don't remember.
So
all this.
the theory here, let's just say the theory that drove this is that the property owner was trying to take advantage of the relatively new 4 or 5 year old statute on accessory on farm businesses that the state adopted in an effort to promote more adaptive reuses of former agricultural.
That I do not
buildings
remember,
like
but this is a
farms.
new bill.
Yeah, so it's a new bill, so, but, the driver for the state statute on accessory on-farm businesses was like, hey, we have a dairy industry which is dying. It used to dominate the Vermont economy. There's very few dairy farms left. The ones that are left are much bigger, but there's a lot of big old dairy barns that are essentially abandoned, sitting there unused. And we want people to be able to continue to make a living on the land. And so let's create an opening in our state land use statute that says, if you wanted to have a farm stay business for big city folks to bring their kids to see what real farms are like, if you wanted to have a retail operation where you sell your farm products from a stand on the farm, which obviously a lot of farmers do that. If you want to convert a barn to an event venue and have concerts and weddings there, all those things are sort of blessed by state government, and they encourage towns to adopt sort of enabling rules in their zoning bylaws that would accommodate the kinds of uses that towns feel comfortable with. So I think that's kind of the chain of thinking that got us to where this has become.
I think that's loosely correct.
Yeah.
And then your number two, just before you,
Yeah.
speaking of Drizzo, there was concern that we were going to, correct me if I'm wrong here, everyone, over-regulate in the sense that let's just use the harvest market.
Mhm.
We were not trying to say you can't do the harvest market or you can't host I think the exact example that was used, you can't host your niece's wedding
Mhm.
in your field, right? That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to regulate commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah, a barn that's like the one there in Jericho on the corner of Brown Straits. That's
Which is where the event was last night that I attended.
Yeah.
So I got to see that up close in person.
Yeah,
That's a
so-
great spot.
So
Yeah.
if somebody wanted to do that in town, then
Yes.
it would have to go to the DRB. Obviously, anything would go to the DRB, but we're trying to come up with some very basic regulations to weed out anybody who just wants to do it anywhere,
Right.
I guess.
So the heart of conditional use review is trying to address the impact of a completely new use on a property and on the property's neighbors and on the town, like roads in general.
Mhm.
And the nature of the use is important because if it's a infrequent use that doesn't involve a lot of cars, doesn't involve a lot of customers, doesn't involve a lot of traffic, well, it's not hard for a property owner to introduce that new use as long as they prepare the site appropriately. So that's why conditional use review is an appropriate regulatory tool, because it requires the property owner to apply for it. It requires a public hearing so the neighbors can come in and speak to the potential impact on their properties, adjoining properties. It requires site plan considerations, so things like access off the road, parking, lighting, runoff management, septic arrangements for guests and customers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think all that in the draft that you prepared makes sense. But the question is this something that you want to regulate as a distinct type of use as we regulate sawmills, as we regulate earth moving operations, as we regulate other things?
Restaurants, I mean, to me, it's a restaurant,
Yeah.
basically. It should be treated in a very similar situation.
Or is this something that could be appropriately handled as a sort of a temporary use? Because an event venue in an uninsulated barn is probably not going to do much business between November 1st and late April or something. So it's a seasonal use. There are many other kinds of seasonal uses, right? And to the extent that other towns have chosen to regulate this, and my point in my questions was I couldn't find much of that. At last night's gathering, one of my colleagues who works at regional planning said, well, look at the town of Waitsfield. Because they do regulate, or they have some kind of a regime for it. And that actually, I found that today and printed it off and passed it around. And what they're regulating is uses that are temporary. So that's the section of their bylaws is titled temporary uses.
Because someone's only renting it for a night, you mean basically?
Yeah, but what if somebody has a barn? This came up when I'm reading what we came up with here.
Yes.
That somebody has a barn and they want to have 5 or 6 events a year,
Yeah.
and they can come into the zoning administrator and get a permit for those 5 events they want to do. So what type of, where do you draw the line between somebody who's doing that and somebody who's building a barn like the one in the Mansfield barn in Jericho? I mean, there's so much gray there, I guess.
Right. So the thing about the distinction I'm trying to draw, and I apologize if this is not clear, but if you create a new section in the land use regs to regulate event venues, and a permit is granted, a conditional use permit is granted for that thing to operate with whatever conditions the DRB sees fit to impose, that permit is permanent and runs with the land. Right. And as a new use, that may be fine, but it might have problems. And if it has problems, would it not be better for the town to have the right to revoke that permit if the operator of this new facility is not conducting themselves in a way that is responsible and meets the town standards? So if you grant a permit instead of making permanent permission that runs with the land forever, instead you make it temporary, then, and temporary can be defined as multiple uses within a specific time frame, like up to 12 or 15 times over a 4-month period.
So you think we need to create a category for that?
I'm saying we already have language in our land use regs right now for temporary uses, and we would need to tweak it. I pointed out one sentence that's a little problem. But I think it might be wiser to make it sort of conditional that, you say, yeah, you can do this. You can have up to 3 events per month or 4 events per month for between mid-April and mid-October or something like that. And then the permit expires. And if the property owner conducted themselves in a responsible way, they prepared the site, they have a good facility, they operated it in a way that was, thoughtful and had virtually no impact on the neighbors. Well, they come back the next year and get a renewal. And then, but if there were problems, the town could either say, no, we're not going to renew that permit because we don't like what you did. You didn't address the conditions. And that way you don't have to take them to court as you would with enforcement of a nuisance ordinance.
Yeah, right.
You can just say, no, you can't do this year. And you could be the town would probably be completely transparent about that. And it would be based in part on conduct during the time that the temporary permit was in effect. If everything's cool, everybody's happy with how it's running, it's bringing people in unremarkable way to the site, have a good time, and they're not bothering the neighbors, and they're not creating problems with septic runoff or, whatever, traffic, parking impacts on their neighbors, then, it would be a routine thing for them to come in and get a new permit for the next 6 months.
So is that standard? I didn't read this, but is that?
It's pretty much how Waitsfield does it, yeah.
This is really good. I love this. I would like drop it in.
Yeah.
I would cut and paste it. I would just add personally, like if it was me, I don't know what everyone else thinks. I would just add, I liked our hours. Like you can't begin before 9 or end after 11.
Yeah.
I see what they're doing. They're just kind of saying everything's cumulative, but
Yeah.
I would add the one specific thing about like you can't start before 9 or end after 11.
Mm-hmm.
And other than that, like, yeah, I mean, this is way better than what we did in the first one.
So will we have 2 sections for event venues? One for permanent structure, like the Mansfield Barn, and another?
No, it'd all be this. Every year, the Mansfield Barn, if it were in Underhill, would come in and say, yeah, we're going to host 4 events a month. And they'd just be some sort of repetitive thing. It'd be on file.
So
and then just pull a permit. But if, let's say they sold the Mansfield Barn next year to some
it's not transferable.
Right, they sold it to some jerk who wants to hold like trance parties every Saturday. Like they could just not give them the permit, right?
Let's use the term raves or something.
Oh, you said trance.
I said trance.
Okay.
Trance. I said trance. Dance. Come on, you're a music man.
I was like, I don't know what it's saying.
No, it's just like.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around one piece here. So let's say somebody wants to build a wedding venue.
Mm-hmm.
The town's okay with it and wants to approve it. Do they still have to come and get?
So you'd have to get this every year. So
that becomes
you're pointing out a risk to the.
Oh, that seems a little.
If you weren't operating it responsibly in the view of the DRB, then yeah, you could have a wedding venue in 3 years where the town's like, yeah, we're not giving you a permit.
Yeah, that would be a problem because you're making a business decision, right? And you need to be able to recover the investment over time and be profitable. So if there's no guarantee that they'll be able to operate, I mean, you're not going to get a new restaurant to move in and build a restaurant and invest, knowing that in 3 years the town might be like, we don't want that pizza shop there anymore. We're going to hope that
the restaurant wouldn't fall under this, but you're right about the.
Yes, I'm just giving an example. The exact same thing.
I have a problem with this because if somebody wanted to build the Mansfield Barn or the event venue that's going in on Pleasant Valley Road, and they went through the process to get a conditional use permit to have a business, and they could, I think that seems like something that we should allow if they go through the process.
Right.
And also
So you think
allow
it should
the
be
temporary.
permanently allowed as long as you follow the rules?
You could have a permanent business that's an event venue, but you could also have another temporary, I'm gonna put a tent in my farm field and have, 2 events a month there for the whole year. You should be able to do that too.
Well, to me, those are the same thing though, in terms of rules.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying, one's temporary, but you should have to follow the same rules, right? Because it's equally intrusive to your neighbors.
Yeah. But Mansfield Barn will have an event on a Friday and one on a Saturday.
Sure.
It's like, not just one a week or one a month.
Yeah, there's definitely a critical, to Zach's point and your point, there's definitely a critical mass that's important for these kinds of businesses. I mean, you have to hire staff, you have to make arrangements for catering, which we did at Mansfield Barn last night through the Jericho Cafe and Tavern. You have to obviously, make some investment in facilities, building driveways, septic, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that's a legit point.
Well, they're just different enforcement mechanisms on the back end, right? Like we could still take this language and use it and change it because I do think it's better. But like, one is, to your point, like one is, once you have the permit, you can just do it as long as you follow the rules. And if you're not following the rules, then the zoning administrator would have to fine you and like figure it out, right?
Right.
And the other one is they could just say, yeah, you're not following the rules, I'm not gonna issue your next permit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking,
Your point's taken about one.
part of my thinking about this is
Well, if you're not following the rules, I mean, if you're violating the,
nuisance ordinance, for example.
uh,
Nuisance ordinance or the septic rules.
well, no, I don't know. I mean, there may be a set of rules as far as how it's to operate, and if you're not going to be operating according to those rules, you know, you're using the permit to expand it into areas that weren't really covered, actually.
And maybe there's a clause that just says, states that it can be revoked, not necessarily it needs to be renewed every year.
Oh, that's a good, that's a
Yeah,
good
that
alternative.
would, that's kind of what I was thinking. That
Yeah.
would make more sense to me.
Well, here's another scenario that I could see happening, which they have in Jeffersonville, right on the mountain road there. There's an event venue that is in use probably several nights a week.
Mhm.
And would that fall within what we're trying to accomplish here? How could we accommodate that if somebody wanted to do that in an appropriate place?
But interestingly, Cambridge does not have any rule about event venues.
Yeah, but it's like a restaurant almost.
Yeah.
You know, the Stowe Mountain Resort.
Yeah, I
brings
know what you're
groups of
talking
people-
about. Yeah.
Bring groups of people there
Yes.
for, you know, dinner and wine tasting and that
Yeah,
sort of
but Cambridge, they don't regulate anything.
Yeah, but
that's
so,
part of
but
it.
still, if somebody wanted to do that in Underhill, would we try to accommodate them with a conditional use permit to build a business like that, is my question.
I mean, I think it's in the town's interest to allow that with appropriate review and site plan considerations. And also just important to note here, to David's point a moment ago, that the town is not without resources to deal with outlaw businesses that we give a permit to operate and then they start breaking the rules from day one. So, you know, the operator has to get a state septic permit for the degree of wastewater that will be generated from 120 guests or 180 or whatever. They have to, and that's between them and the state. And they violate those rules, they're subject to fines and enforcement from the state. If they are allowing cars to be parked in their neighbor's property illegally, that's subject to enforcement through the nuisance ordinance. If they're making loud noise, it's not mitigated, that's subject to enforcement through the nuisance ordinance. But I will say that with respect to town ordinances, enforcing town ordinances, including conditional use permits, it's a pain for the town to get relief through that because you know, the zoning administrator has to go out and document the violations. They have to issue civil fines, like writing a ticket. They have to then appear in court and defend those tickets, which can be contested by the property owner who's in violation. And then, you know, you have to go and get sometimes a separate enforcement order to actually collect fines. So it's a very convoluted process for towns to get relief when a property owner is not following the rules. And, you know, I feel like, you know, it's really just important to know there's this bright line between a permanent permit that runs with the land and gives permission to continue doing something indefinitely versus a temporary permit that the town can choose not to renew at its own discretion without going through all that legal hoo-ha involving a lot of lawyers and trying to enforce something that most people would think shouldn't be a big deal to enforce. And we don't have a police force in Underhill who can go out and look menacing, you know, and tell someone, turn down the volume.
You do have to have the person who's going to be putting the money into the whole project and so on, have the assurance that it will be continuing.
Sure.
Yeah, as we were saying.
So how does everybody feel about having two different bylaws for temporary and for permanent event venues? Are we getting too complicated here, or is the permanent structure like has been approved for out here on Pleasant Valley Road? Is that something that we feel like we want to continue to allow and to come up with some regulations for that, or what? How does everybody feel about that?
I agree, it almost seems like they're almost two different issues. You may have somebody who's just like doing something 2 or 3 times a year on a smaller scale and augmenting their income as opposed to a business. It's like, we're gonna have an event venue that's,
Yeah.
That's gonna be our income. It's gonna be a full-time business.
Yeah,
Yeah, it makes sense. There's not another place in the land use regs that speak to the kind of permanent sort of places, because I know I think your preference is that we don't add new section 4.20 and that we fold it into the temporary, or we kind of add to that.
I'm just looking at it from the enforcement point of view.
Yeah.
But I think that the question that's being raised here is totally legit.
Yeah.
You know, like if you're wanted to start a business like this, and it would require you to invest $800,000 to build a barn and at least, and get your septic permits and, you know, construct driveways and parking and all that stuff. You do want that certainty. And it's legitimate to expect that if the town grants you a permit, that it's not going to be questioned, you know, after 6 months or a year, if you're following the rules. You know, and I reflect on a couple of and pardon me for telling stories here, but in Charlotte, there's a couple of examples of this. So one was, are people familiar with the old Adjourn Hall?
Yeah.
On Greenbush Road in Charlotte. So that is an event venue that's been there for probably 100 years. And the neighboring property owners decided that they didn't like that. And so they took them to court, saying that they didn't have a permit to operate as an event venue or a restaurant or anything else. And went all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, like with the bike crossing issue, told the neighboring property owners to go take a hike because it was a grandfathered use that existed long before the town had zoning rules. But then another example is there's on Route 7 just south of the traffic signal at Ferry Road. There's somebody took down the old Vermont Wildflower Farm building, and they built a multi-use commercial project, and part of that was a pizza restaurant on the ground floor. And they got a septic permit with the state for, I think it was up to 27 seats in the restaurant. And then they promptly proceeded to put up a tent on the patio outside. And pretty much every summer night on the weekends, they had at least 50 or 60 people dining there, which is clearly a violation of the state septic permit. And the town embedded that limit in its conditional use and site plan approval for that restaurant. And then the town was like, well, how do we enforce that if the state doesn't enforce it? And that was still, conversation was still going on when I retired at the end of last year. It was not easily resolved because, you know, the restaurant owners didn't want the town to tell them, oh, you got to take down the tent and not have these extra 30 seats outside. And the state was not inclined to step in and shut the restaurant down, which is probably what they should have done for not following.
Why wouldn't they though? Why doesn't somebody have jurisdiction? Why would somebody have jurisdiction over that?
Business. It's successful.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there is momentum once you open a business and you start, you know, having a lot of customers and you're making, you know, good money probably doing it. You know, I think the state has a hard time shutting people down if it's a viable business and it doesn't seem to be doing measurable harm to the environment. Who knows if that's the case there? But I'm just thinking about those two examples. You know, these kinds of commercial projects, if they're well managed and they're following the rules, great, everybody's happy. But if things go south and they're having impacts on the neighbors in terms of traffic and parking and septic runoff coming out of the mound system that they put in and things like that, and you know, what is the town's recourse? And you know, it shouldn't be difficult for the town to pull that back and say, you know, this is not going according to plan, you're not following the conditions in the permit, and let's either rectify the situation or we're not going to renew the permit. It seems like a little bit more bulletproof a strategy. But if you all feel like you want to have two different things, you want to have a temporary use, and that's sort of like the Waitsfield draft here, or bylaw, and then have a permanent use, I can continue to work on the permit.
Is that everybody feel?
That sounds like a good idea.
I think so, yeah.
Oh.
Maybe we could play around with something in the permanent that puts, I know this is probably asking a lot, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time discussing it too, but maybe we try to come up with a provision in the permanent that gives the town a little teeth for someone who's just blatantly violating the town's rules.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would not be through, it would be through the nuisance ordinance or something else.
Yeah.
And then that's where you get into all the legal challenges there. But I mean, I can look into that if there's any sort of replicable.
Okay.
So Squaw Betty has weddings there, right?
Yeah, they do.
Do they get permits for those, or how's that? Do you know
I
anything
don't
about?
know.
Because I
Is that, is that in Cambridge or is that?
That's
in
in-
No, no, it's squarely in Underhill. Because it's,
Oh,
you're just off Dean Road. So.
But they've been doing that forever.
Yeah, maybe that's
Your grandfather, I
grandfather or
suppose.
something.
What do they have parking for up there?
I couldn't imagine getting 100 cars up there.
No way.
No.
They could be
It's
like
like,
our.
well,
They've got a lot of space there.
Although there's that whole
There's a
field.
lot of space, but it's just going up that road.
Parking, lots of parking.
Yeah, because there's that whole
There's a
field
whole
before you get to the
field they're
tennis
parking. They're parking in the tennis court.
Right.
Parking.
Yeah. No,
It's
there's,
such a big.
And this one on Pleasant Valley Road that triggered this whole thing, did they open or?
they got a permit, but they haven't
They
built it
open?
yet.
Have they done any work yet?
I don't think so. I thought it's Phil's sister.
Yeah.
I asked him about it. He said she was just thinking about doing it at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. It hasn't been.
We weren't really involved at all. I mean, it was
Yeah.
all the DRBs, so.
Yep.
This was a request that they gave us to address some type of.
Yep. It was just, do you know if it was just a straight up zoning permit or was it a conditional use
It was a conditional use permit.
for
They
what?
had to, for what?
For what?
For a wedding venue, a wedding barn.
Okay.
So it started out trying to, I'm not really sure. You have to ask Charlie about all that.
You know, know for sure is Brian.
Yeah.
I'm sure he was intimately involved.
I will ask.
The only other piece of the temporary rates as drafted that I kind of had an issue with is, I think like setting a beginning and end time is good, but that 6 hours, including setup and takedown, feels a little prohibitive. I mean, I think if I'm not having if I'm going to set a big wedding table in the field and hire this company.
Oh, I don't think
it's-
that's bad drafting. I don't think we intended that. I think it was like the event. has
The
to-
actual, maybe there's some clear.
No, it's just
that
bad
like-
drafting.
Yeah, just because the setup and tear down, we should have let people do
We
it.
just meant the actual event.
Yeah, okay.
No, that's
Yeah,
a
that
good
makes
point.
sense.
And the objective is to avoid like Burning Man or something.
Yeah.
Again,
Or
it
the
falls in the
trans-
category of nothing's never gonna happen. Yes, that one is, that's a good example.
Probably another wedding venue will never be
Well,
built.
if we want to, look, Waitsfield has a festival ordinance, so we can consult with them. They might have
There it is.
something for that.
It's a
too.
festival permit, yeah.
Would it be plagiarism if we use that?
Oh, no, we can cut and paste.
That's,
easy.
that's what's known as, high praise when you
That's
copy
right.
someone else.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, so we can leave that with you for
Yeah.
a comment
Twice further
there.
away.
That takes us to the minute, don't pick up yet, we're gonna go on the minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, did anyone have any questions or comments on the minutes from the June 5th meeting?
Oh, yeah, I have one quick one that
Yes,
is small,
thank
but it's like halfway through page 4, when we were talking about ADUs.
Yep.
It's about halfway down the 4th page, says David brought up that the 400-foot regulation might be an issue with the DRB. And I think it was more just, it might be an issue. And then what I said about the DRB is more to David's point at the end of the paragraph, that I think we're covered because it as drafted says that there's an out for the DRB to waive the 400. but-
So if we deleted with the DRB.
yeah, that would
would
do
be
it.
more accurate. Okay.
I don't want to make it seem like the DRB's job's any harder. I'm sure they can measure for
Okay.
Yeah, good point.
So I'll make the motion then so that we can, so I'll move that we approve the June 5th minutes with David's clarification on page 4. Is there a second?
Second.
Bart, all in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous.
So,
Bart seconded it.
minutes. And you make the motion.
I made a motion.
Unanimous with changes, okay.
So our next meeting is July 10th. Is that correct?
Yes, so 3 weeks from today.
Reminding myself as much as anyone else. And at that meeting, we will finalize trails. And let's devote a decent amount of time to event venues, because it sounds like it might take some time to get through.
Yeah.
So let's try to wrap that up. So it sounds like if we finalize trails, maybe give like an hour to event venues, and then we can take a few minutes and discuss public hearing dates, if we can finish event venue.
Okay.
Is that crazy, Mayor?
That sounds good. I will let you know that, talked last night with Christian, the town planner in Jericho.
Yeah.
And he asked me if it would be helpful for him to make a time to come and talk to this group about a little bit more about what they're hoping to do.
Sure.
In part because now that the legislature has adopted the Act, Senate Bill 127.
That'd be great.
And there's all kinds of state money available to help with smaller projects like what's proposed for Jericho and the Flats District. That, you know, he wants to help us sort of answer our questions and understand the project, and, you know, what the time frame would be if we wanted to jump on board as a formal support.
Could we try to
That'd be
get him in on July 17th?
You could try. I mean, it's obviously subject to his availability.
Yeah. Do you want to see if he's available?
Yeah.
Thanks for that'd be
Yeah, that's
amazing.
great.
Yeah,
That'd be good to,
it'd be good to know what they're up to.
yeah.
What do they want to build?
They're proposing a small community wastewater system, which I think would be, the leach fields would actually be in Underhill, just over the border from near Browns River Middle School, or on the grounds of Browns River Middle School, but some part of the infrastructure would be in Underhill. And that it would be hopefully mostly paid for with grants and bonds, and to the extent that the towns had to bond for the town share of the cost, assuming that it gets designed and approved, that the cost be split 90% to the town of Jericho and 10% to the town of Underhill. And that that's cost sharing would enable us to use that capacity for properties on the Underhill side of the town line and the Flats district and the village district that we have. So for example, if an existing property owner was having problems with their septic, or if they wanted to duplex their single family house or add an ADU, but they didn't have sufficient septic capacity on their lot, they could tap into the community system.
But they wouldn't be required to.
They would not be required.
Would they have to incur the cost of hooking in, or is
Yes.
that part of a bond? Is this part of a bond, or is
It would be part of a bond, and there would be rules and a cost structure set up for anyone that wanted to abandon their private septic and hook up to the community septic. So you would pay a hookup fee, and then you would pay the monthly, there would be like a monthly bill that you paid for your usage of the system, which could be metered or not. You know, that's kind of how it's done in other communities.
And what about like the sewer system project that would be associated with transporting said
Yeah, all
to
the
this community?
all the infrastructure would be part of the bond. And typically for a system of this size, we're not talking about a sewage treatment plant, just to be clear. We're talking about a leach field and pump stations and septic tank system that would be connected with pipes. And you would be very surprised to learn how far those can extend. You know, in Charlotte, they had a small community wastewater system that was designed to serve the town municipal complex in the West Village. And the leach field for that was half a mile away.
Yeah.
And several properties over. And then there was like a pump station at the site, and there was another pump station in front of town hall. And they did allow hookups for other commercial uses in addition to the library and the town hall and the post office and the fire station, which were the main customers. But they took a long time to figure out the rules for that. But again, everybody covered the hookup costs and who wanted to do the system and paid a monthly fee or quarterly fee for the use of the system. But we're not talking about like a sewage treatment plant like you have on Lake Champlain in the downtown Burlington waterfront. We're talking about essentially a mound system, a leach field that's underground. All the infrastructure is underground. And, unless the system massively malfunctioned, you would never know it's there except for the inspection plates on the surface.
I still am, if they can sell everyone on putting a giant leach field in a school field, this guy needs to get hired to sell other stuff. Amazing.
But if you're educated on how it works, you would not be intimidated.
It's just the headline. It's terrible.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Under the baseball field.
That looks terrible.
The Browns River kids are already enduring enough ridicule from.
Is there development going on over that way where they want
They have
to
a whole
install
plant,
that?
you know where the old sawmill is, like by Jericho Market, like that big barn.
Yeah.
thing? It's, I mean, he can give us the whole thing, obviously, but if you go to Jericho's website, I can't tell you where to go because I can't remember anymore, but if you poke around, you can find a whole plan for that site.
Uh-huh.
It was
That
like
shows like
90,
townhouses and
It's gonna
senior
be,
living
yeah.
and like, it's like a whole.
Oh, they're gonna do something with that?
Yeah,
My wife has been asking
Major.
about that.
Yeah.
it's a pretty major
Yeah.
development.
It's a big project.
They were going for 90 units, but I think it's probably going to be downsized from that.
So that project, the permitting for that project is incomplete. And it's probably stalled because of the septic issue, because if they had to do their own septic just for that development, it would add a whole lot to the price tag and make it, out of reach for a lot of the kinds of folks they want to build housing for, and for the commercial uses as well, because it's a mixed use project.
Yeah.
But if there's going to be a community wastewater system that's installed to serve that parcel and big enough to also serve other nearby parcels, that's a game changer for that project. It would probably allow it to go forward. So,
Okay.
and that's all on the Jericho side of Park Street, which is why we were talking earlier about, we don't really have any say-so over it, except as, it might affect traffic in Underhill and other things that are legit concerns, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. So we'll all be experts on it, May and July 19th. Yeah. And you'll have lots of gossip for your life.
That sounds good.
July 10th is the next meeting.
Yeah. Yep.
And thank you all for being
I
flexible.
think that's the one I'm not able to join,
Yeah.
but then
July
I can come
10th,
to I can
Okay.
come at the end of the month.
Okay. Awesome.
So if Chris can't come on the 10th, it may be the 24th.
Yeah, well, we can just let me know and we can play off
Okay.
whatever you want to do.
Okay. Okay, and I'm bringing back the trails.
Yeah, the minor changes, very minor changes to drills, and then the more heavy lift, much heavier lift on the dimensions. Okay. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, thanks, Larry.
Which takes us to the longest serving member of the planning commission. Is there anything you want to say, David?
Yeah, there's one thing. I'd like to make a motion.
Sure.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Zach. All in favor?
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.